Tonight on All In.
The United States isn't waiting. This is the decisive decade.
The White House goes big on climate. Tonight, the case for optimism about the biggest problem on the planet. Then, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries on the new Democratic offer to begin a January 6th commission. Now, one major American city has made big strides in reforming its police department on the day Dante Wright is laid to rest.
Words can't even explain how I feel right now. You know, that was my son.
Plus, fixing the democratic system as the House votes to add another state to the union. And on this Earth Day, Jacob Soboroff on LA's big new push to turn toilet water into tap water.
So about a day ago, what I flushed down my toilet has ended up with this.
Yeah.
Hey, let's hit.
But All In starts right now. Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. For literally decades, climate scientists and activists, observers, politicians have been saying this is the moment we must rally to stop the planet from warming, to save the Earth from catastrophe.
Now more than ever, we stand at the door of opportunity, wondering whether the door will close before we act to control the greenhouse effect.
We simply must halt global warming. It is a threat to our health, to our ecology, and to our economy.
There's some basic facts about global warming. It's real simple. The science is real, the effects are profound, and inaction is not an option.
And today I call on all countries to join us. Not next year or the year after that, but right now.
Climate change is real, it's urgent, and America can take the lead in the world in addressing it, right?
Mother Nature is giving us a very clear and powerful message. We've got to stop that. We've got to wake up and recognize the need for change.
For 35 years, right? We've been saying it's time to act, and every year carbon emissions go up more or less. And the pattern in how we deal with climate change in this country has been this. Democratic politicians, if they are elected to the White House, they try to set goals, they try to move towards them, and then Republicans come in and just scrap the whole plan, tear it up, demagogue the issue, pretend climate change is not a problem, and deny it all. And that's even though in the past the commitments by Democratic presidents themselves were insufficient. The obstruction from Republicans keeps leading to this kind of oscillating wave in American climate policy between too little action and then just complete nihilistic denialism. Those are like the two modes we have, okay? That has been happening for literally multiple generations of American climate policy. But, we do have a rare confluence in this moment. The climate situation is, of course, both the most dire it's ever been and the most promising for real change at the same time. There's a few reasons. One, a lot of lessons have been learned. There are a lot of battle scars to show for it. The Earth has already warmed a ton. It is going to continue to warm more just based on the carbon we've already put in the atmosphere. But today, President Biden announced the most concerted, ambitious pledge on carbon emissions we have ever had in this country, bar none, pledging to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 50% to 52% by 2030.
By maintaining those investments and putting these people to work, the United States sets out on the road to cut greenhouse gases in half by the end of this decade. All of us, and particularly those of us who represent the world's largest economies, we have to step up because scientists tell us that this is the decisive decade. This is the decade we must make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis.
All right, so you're hearing that, and you've heard the montage before, and you're thinking to yourself, well, you know, talk is cheap. I literally have heard this before, like 2 minutes earlier in your segment. True. But it is not crazy to allow yourself a little bit of optimism about this today, and here's why. First of all, this is a short-term goal. 2030 is just 9 years away. I mean, the Biden administration is going to oversee at least half of that almost, right? That means there is much more accountability for the people involved as opposed to these 2050 goals you often hear about, which are easy to make when most of the people in charge will be long gone by the time we hit that benchmark. Also, the economics of green energy are completely changing at a clip that is almost too fast for me to be able to communicate. Solar and wind power are now cheaper than ever, and they are cheaper than coal. They're actually cheaper than coal by a lot. Look at this chart. You can see how expensive solar power used to be on the far left there, and then it just drops way below coal, way below. As a result, big banks and investors are starting to back away from all fossil fuels, okay? They're backing away from coal. Coal's basically dead. We've known that. But now they're starting to get out of natural gas. There's a natural gas retreat that's happening that is new. And green energy is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, which means huge amounts of capital flowing into green tech and green investment. There are all these electric cars coming out, incredible upward revisions in electric vehicle projections and adoption. I mean, who would have imagined an electric Hummer a few years ago? Plus, if you look at this administration, it's also just very evident that addressing climate change is genuinely a priority. That matters a lot, right? Whether the president and the people around him care about an issue as a priority matters a lot. Politico reported today President Biden plans to push these climate goals even if Congress does not move with him. One of the first things Biden did after getting elected was announce a clean energy team, something that wasn't even mentioned, of course, in the last administration. And a lot of the pending infrastructure package, right? This is the second big piece of legislation which has already been rolled out, right? It works on transitioning the U.S. toward a green economy. I think President Biden learned the lessons from President Obama's big cap and trade bill that Republicans killed. The way to do it, the way to push green policies is through thousands of small interventions in policies by pressing on a lot of different levers rather than one big one. Of course, climate change is a global problem. We have to be realistic and clear-eyed, always. So we've got the Paris climate deal Trump pulled us out of famously. Biden put us back in. But here's the thing. Even the nations that stayed in the Paris deal are not really meeting their requirements. So if any of this is going to work, okay, the Biden administration has to deliver on carbon emission cuts the way they have delivered on vaccines, right? They pledged to do something, they went out and they did it. They have to do it quickly, efficiently, and comprehensively. They need to say, we are going to fix this thing, and then go out and show the world they can. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat of Rhode Island, has delivered 279 speeches calling attention to the climate crisis, and he joins me now. Senator, first, your reaction to the announcement of the targets today and this administration's push on this.
I think it's great. This was at the leading edge of the plausible window of options. And, 50% plus by 2030 is a real serious commitment.
So I guess the question is, how do we get from here to there? And I think, back when I was covering the Obama administration, which had pretty ambitious climate goals coming in, it was the cap and trade bill, it was wax and market, it passed out of the House, Republicans in the Senate killed it. I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there's a real strategic shift now in how you and your Democratic colleagues think about the policy mechanisms. Talk me through how you think about it in the absence of a big, climate bill that Republicans won't vote for.
Well, I think, for starters, I think there will be a big climate bill. I think that the Build Back Better jobs bill will be that climate bill, and we're going to work very hard to make sure that it is that climate bill. And behind that comes Glasgow and the World Conference to update the Paris Agreement, and perhaps another round of legislation to fill in for that. And in the Senate right now, there are bills moving forward on industrial emissions, on agricultural emissions, on oceans-related issues, and a lot of these are bipartisan. So you're right, something has shifted, and the momentum is gathering and growing, and I think we just have to lean in as hard as we can and make sure we're doing everything we can along the way. And I think for the first time, after many, many years of despair and frustration about this, I'm starting to feel that we're going to get there.
When you say, I don't want to blow up anyone's spot, because one thing I'm painfully aware of is that, the only way for Republicans in some ways to be on the right side of some of these policy issues is for no one to notice. So I don't want to throw a monkey wrench in that plan. But when you say there's stuff on industrial emissions or agricultural emissions that is bipartisan, that's kind of news to me. Talk me through what does that look like? What's that collaborative process look like?
Well, let's start with the ag bill, which we went to the press conference day before yesterday, I want to say. It has 20 Republican co-sponsors, and it will instruct the Department of Agriculture to build a verifiable carbon offset so that farmers can say, if I do this, if I do this, if I do this, will I get carbon credit for this? And the Department of Agriculture can say yes and send the money for using good farming and foresting and ranching practices. And that could explode once that is established throughout the industry. We have the carbon capture industry growing thanks to the so-called 45Q tax credit. If you can capture the damn stuff out of the atmosphere, then we can really accelerate our ability to meet these targets. And there's the industrial technologies bill, which provides support for R&D for different industries to take advantage of things that the utilities, for instance, are doing with clean air standards and bring those into manufacturing, bring them into steel making, bring them into cement making, and so forth. And all of those bits are bipartisan at this point.
That is, so this is a sort of proof of concept of the kind of thesis, right? That, you know, again, those are all in what we generally call kind of must pass bills, right? Like you got to pass the ag bill, and the ag bill's going to pass. So the question is, like, well, what can you do in the ag bill on emissions? And there's, I mean, it seems to me like that's the direction things have gone increasingly in the wake of the 2009 situation.
Yeah, I think the rule has to be every bill has to be a climate bill, and there has to be a big climate bill.
Right.
And if we follow that rule, I think we'll get there.
Do you think that on the big climate bill part of it, like, I mean, is that, would the politics of that look the same that we have anticipated and different from, say, the ag bill or other stuff, right? Because it does seem to me like it's one of these things where if you raise the salience of it, even though it's very popular, 65% popularity, it's just one of these issues where Republicans, as soon as you raise the salience, they're like, I want to stick it to the libs and you can't tell me not to, burn coal, yada, yada, yada.
Well, let me say two things about that. The first is that we've got a good start on a big bill right now with a massive investment in electronic vehicles and electronic vehicle infrastructure to turn the transportation sector around. And the clean electricity standard that is in the Biden plan is very strong. And if we could bake into that also a penalty on carbon emissions that can fund even more good work, then we're talking about, I think, something really, really significant. So that's point one. Point two is that the Republicans are a little bit less comfortable where they are now than where they used to be, because a lot of the apparatus of climate denial and obstruction is blowing up. So the American Petroleum Institute is getting some real pushback. The Chamber of Commerce, which was one of the two worst climate obstructors in America, is in a state of internal turmoil as it turns toward climate action. Today, the National Association of Manufacturers, the other worst climate obstructor in America, came out applauding Joe Biden's standard and saying manufacturing is going to be what gets this done. So all of that is new, and the apparatus of obstruction and denial is beginning to collapse. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the Koch brothers, Marathon Petroleum, and a couple of crazy dead enders. And at that point, I don't think there's much for the Republicans to rally around any longer.
It's funny. Sometimes you conceive of a segment as you're doing it, you're like, am I talking myself into something? And we sort of went through it, but then I talked to you, and now I'm convinced of my own thesis, which is always a nice feeling that there really is a moment here. There really is opportunity. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, always great to talk to you on
in
this
the Democratic Senate is greater than ever. Remember that the Republicans didn't want cap and trade, but the White House and the Senate leadership is what took it down and didn't even get it a vote in the Senate. So, we have our own problems from the past. Those are over. There is a really solid commitment from Joe Manchin right across the board to solving this.
All right, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a real leader on this. Thank you so much for your time. I've said this before. It's worth repeating that it is still astounding to me that we still do not have a comprehensive, thorough public accounting what happened during the January 6th attack. Instead, we're still left trying to piece together the full picture from off-the-record sources and reporters and then court documents. It doesn't have to be this way. In fact, there's a renewed effort from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to hold a full 9/11 style commission. There's a new proposal out today. So why aren't Republicans on board? That's next. It has been more than 100 days since the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and there still has been zero comprehensive public accounting on exactly what happened that day. For example, Capitol Police initially said that fallen officer Brian Sicknick was injured while physically engaging with protesters. And that is what they said the day after the attack. It's how we reported, many did, day after day for over 3 months. Until the Washington, D.C. medical examiner ruled this week that Officer Sicknick died of natural causes. According to the medical examiner, Sicknick suffered 2 strokes and showed no evidence of internal or external injuries, though the medical examiner did note that all that transpired played a role in Sicknick's condition. And we know, not from the medical examiner, but from some incredible New York Times reporting, that Sicknick was sprayed with some kind of substance, most likely bear spray, by the attackers on January 6th. But that's a perfect example of what I'm finding frustrating about January 6th. Almost everything we've learned about the events those days has come from the sources off the record or court filings or journalists scraping through video or leaked details from closed-door briefings and internal documents. Yesterday, for example, in a hearing about the attack, Democratic Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren of California revealed new details about a message that went out to Capitol Police officers the morning of the 6th.
So if an officer said in one of the reviews on the morning of January 6th, and this is a quote, a radio broadcast was sent to all outside units, attention, all units on the field were not looking for any pro-Trump in the crowd. We're only looking for any anti-pro-Trump who wants to start a fight.
Now, the Capitol Police pushed back on that today, issuing a statement saying that this was one of many different back and forths throughout the day. Congressman Lofgren said the key detail came from an internal investigation. But again, we learn of this from a hearing. Capitol Police try to push back. And so what are we to make of it? So far, the only public report we've gotten since January 6th is that 13-page security review from retired Lieutenant General Russell Honore. That's helpful information for the future, but it's not good enough. We still do not have an official tick-tock of the events of that day, and we need it. Nearly 20 years ago in this country, very famously, came under attack, we formed a national commission to fully investigate what happened. And the 9/11 Commission produced a more than 500-page report, a public, comprehensive accounting of exactly what happened. That is the kind of investigation and work product we need to understand what happened on January 6th and to move forward. Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat of New York, is the chair of the House Democratic Caucus, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, and he joins me now. Congressman, where does this commission stand right now?
Well, we are moving forward to try to arrive at common ground with the Republicans so we can form a bipartisan commission that can comprehensively study the events of January 6th and the events leading up to January 6th, including the radicalization that perhaps led to the mob storming the Capitol that day, and then prepare a comprehensive report, as you've articulated, that was done in connection with 9/11 and report to the American people. And the Speaker has made clear that it's important for it to be bipartisan, but that, of course, requires an agreement in good faith with the other side of the aisle. To try to reach that agreement, she's indicated that we're willing for the commission to be evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, and for the chair, which would be a Democratic appointment, and the vice chair, presumably a Republican appointment, to jointly have the ability to issue subpoenas as opposed to simply the chair having unilateral authority. The major area of disagreement right now seems to be on the scope, Chris, because the Republicans, to some degree, are in fantasy land as it relates to their wish lists as to what the scope of the commission should be.
I want to read just to reiterate this idea. So you know, this is a fairly standard kind of setup for these sorts of things, right? Evenly split, a chair, vice chair, some sort of agreement for subpoenas. Pelosi has agreed to make the panel evenly split between Democrats and Republicans to change the way subpoenas would be issued, requiring a joint decision by the chair and vice chair or after a majority vote. Tell me what the scope debate is.
So our view is that the commission should be focused on the events of January 6th, the violent attack on the Capitol, the incitement of an insurrection, the perpetration of the big lie, and the role that it played in the radicalization that we saw manifest itself by the storming of the Capitol. That's fairly straightforward. The events of 9/11 were the scope of the 9/11 Commission, not a whole host of other conspiratorial views or political fantasies that some may have had at the time. Right now, Leader McCarthy has indicated that he wants the scope of this commission to include the Black Lives Matter protest that took place in the summer of 2020. He wants it to include Antifa and the fact that
He wants the January 6th commission to include Black Lives Matter?
That's correct. And he, in fact, Chris, if you can believe it or not, said that at his press conference today. This is not political hyperbole. This is his negotiating position. It's an embarrassment and it's a joke. And it's just not going to happen. And so we're committed to trying to find common ground. Hopefully, some reasonable folks on the other side of the aisle will step in and it will become clear that Kevin McCarthy's position is untenable.
You know, I have to say, like, I understand this partisan wrangling and the ridiculous bad faith of McCarthy there. In my interest as a journalist, as someone who's been covering this, is I've just found the level of transparency wholly inadequate and maddening. I mean, we found out about a person who died from a local news package that happened from a sibling who reported it. And then we find out about this person who's in a Trump administration official because of either caught on video or there's a court filing. Like, all of it just comes out in these different streams. And that's how we find out about this very important thing. No one was out there the next day doing the kind of briefing you see after huge mass casualty events or big things. I mean, it has been crazy to me how terrible the communication of information about this thing that we all witnessed has been.
Absolutely. And this is really a, once in a century, hopefully, type of event that we'll never see again. But Chris, I can promise you this. We are going to get to the bottom of what happened. Hopefully that will be through a 9/11 style commission. But we have majorities in the House and the Senate. We have subpoena power. We can conduct an independent congressional investigation if necessary. We also know that we have a cooperative administration, a cooperative Department of Justice, and hopefully the information that they've accumulated will begin to be put forth into the public domain in a coherent fashion as well. But we're committed to the idea of a commission because we think it's the right thing to do for America to fully understand and receive the truth of what occurred. We just have to overcome this Republican obstructionism, and I believe that we will, one way or the other.
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, member of Democratic leadership, working on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Still
will, one way or the other.
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, member of Democratic leadership, working on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Still a silence tumble in a courtroom in Minneapolis when policemen understand that they are committed to the oath rather than to their colleague. That's when we know a breakthrough is coming. That's when we know we can pass the George Floyd bill because folk are not going to lie on you no more.
Today, at the funeral of 20-year-old Dante Wright, who was shot and killed during a traffic stop by Brooklyn Center police in Minnesota almost 2 weeks ago. Reverend Al Sharpton spoke forcefully about the need for police reform, which has quickly gained momentum after former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was found guilty of murdering George Floyd on Tuesday. Just minutes after that verdict, a police officer in Columbus, Ohio, killed 16-year-old Micaiah Bryant. This is a still image from the officer's body cam, which was released later by the Columbus police. It shows her reportedly holding a knife, appearing to lunge towards someone dressed in pink who was against a parked car. There's an ongoing investigation into her fatal shooting. And then yesterday, Attorney General Merrick Garland announced a federal investigation into the patterns or practices of the Minneapolis Police Department. It's just in the last week, and it points to the fact that there's going to be changes in policing. It's going to happen at the local level. I mean, the federal government can set guidelines, but there are more than 12,000 police departments across the country. Think about that. 5 years ago, Newark, New Jersey, which is one of those 12,000, entered into an agreement with the federal government that prescribed a set of reforms for its police department. And since then, the department has seen some significant progress. Newark officers did not fire a single shot in 2020. They finished 2020 without killing anyone, the first time since 2015. Joining me now is the mayor of the city of Newark, Ras Baraka. Mayor, can you tell us a little bit about what the policies were that you've implemented in Newark in concert with the federal government through this, what we call consent decree?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Chris. I think some of the basic policies, we stood up a civilian review board. That's number one. We had to create new policies for the police department, whether it was stop and frisk, use of force. All the police officers have been trained in bias perception, search and seizure, arrest procedures, de-escalation. These are all new policies that were recreated because of the consent decree. Every officer has a body-worn camera. We've worked hard to make sure that the police department reflects the community that it serves. So it's 75% Black and Latinx, reflecting the community of Newark, New Jersey. And then there's a host of other things that we've done partnering with the community. We created an Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery. And we just put a civilian in charge in terms of the Deputy Police Director for Community Relations. We hired a civilian to head that office up as well.
What are I know that as late as a lot of this is reporting, right? So a big part of what the consent decrees do is data. I know as late as 2019 that data was showing you still had some racial disparities in Black and white folks being stopped by police. I know that use of force had actually gone up at a certain point. Like, what are your outcome metrics that you're judging this as a success or not by?
Well, the community response. So we do polls. We talk to the community and find out what they're feeling about the police department, what they're feeling about safety in the city at the same time. And then that's basically how we gauge what's happening. And we also look at the fact that crime has gone down, but also arrests are going down. So we have proven that there is no direct relationship between arresting people and the reduction of crime. And the more contacts we've had with the community have been based on positive stops. So in the CompStat, when we check in for the rise in crime, rise in shooting, rise in robberies, we also check for how many times the police have interacted with the community in ways that are not about arresting people. 2020,
as the data comes in 2020, it was a very violent year in America, a huge jump in shootings and homicides, specifically in city after city. What has it been like in your city?
Well, by the grace of God, we actually had the same kind of outcomes in 2020 that we had in 2019. We actually, in some areas, even better. As you stated, our police officers didn't fire a shot while almost getting 300-400 guns off the street at the same time. So that's an incredible feat for the police department to do, to that level of restraint. And I'm proud of that. There's a lot more work to be done. So I don't want to, take a victory lap and say that Newark is the perfect place because we still have issues and incidents, but we work through them and we try to be as transparent as possible and make sure people are held accountable for things that they do.
What do you think is the big takeaway for other cities to the extent, and I know this is an incomplete project, obviously, and I know that there was actually a fatal shooting in your city by a police officer in 2021 that sort of broke that streak.
That's right.
What is the sort of takeaway for other cities, though, to your mind, when you look at, say, the announcement from Merrick Garland about Minnesota, the Minneapolis Police Department?
I think it's completely necessary that these consent decrees are necessary. It's obvious that locally these folks are not going to make the kind of changes, the transformative changes that are necessary. And so you need the federal government probably to step in and force this change. And then you need local police and local elected officials to work with them. It does not have to be a negative relationship. We don't have that kind of relationship in Newark. It has to be a relationship where you, the folks from the federal government, the consent decree, and the community work together to repurpose, reimagine what policing should be in your community. And that's what people are calling for all over the nation, a reimagining of policing.
Newark Mayor Ras Baraka, thank you so much for making some time for us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Today, for the second time in history, the House passed legislation that would make Washington, D.C. a state. The bill passed along party lines, and the partisan interests here are very clear, right? Statehood for D.C. would mean, at least in the short term, probably adding 2 Democratic senators. Of course, Democrats have a very obvious interest in making that happen, and Republicans are dead set on opposing it. But Democrats also have a very basic persuasive argument here about representation. I mean, there's 700,000 of our fellow Americans who live in D.C. and have no voting representatives in Congress, in the House or the Senate, meaning they have a delegate they can elect to Congress. That person does not actually get to vote on anything. And as for Republicans, well, they don't really have any good arguments against it, as you can see whenever they come out to defend their position.
With D.C. statehood. D.C. wouldn't even qualify as a singular congressional district, and here they are. They want the power and the authority of being an entire state in the United States.
Now, that's a little bit of a tough sell as an argument to make while standing right next to Congresswoman Liz Cheney. She, of course, the representative for Wyoming's single at-large district, representing 100,000 fewer people than the population of D.C. Then there's Congressman Steve Scalise of Louisiana, who once famously likened himself to a former KKK leader, calling himself David Duke without the baggage. Scalise sounding this racist dog whistle about the crime rate in D.C. Quote, why should the District of Columbia be granted statehood when it can't even perform basic governmental duties like protecting its residents from criminals? The fact of the matter is the geographic polarization in America means the U.S. Senate is straying further and further away from the median voter in this country. Granting statehood to D.C. is a crucial means of rebalancing that. Michelle Goldberg is an op-ed columnist at the New York Times who wrote about the tyranny of the minority and how Republicans have a structural advantage in elections in her very first column at the New York Times back in 2017, and she joins me now. Michelle, it's striking to me how bad the Republican arguments are about this. But I think it's because each side has a partisan interest. The Democrats just have a much stronger actual principled argument here.
Right. The only Republican argument, there are 2 Republican arguments against statehood for D.C. One, that it will benefit Democrats, and 2, that there's something about the people of D.C. that they don't deserve representation. Yes. And indeed, the contempt with which members of our government speak about residents of D.C., I think, is a sign of how badly they need representation.
That's a great point. I mean, you get all these really gross, snippy comments about who D.C. people are in a way that you would never say about residents of other states, but precisely is sayable because they don't have any way of pushing back because they don't have representation.
Well, and there's also just a sort of norm in our politics that people can speak extremely contemptuously about people in cities. And part of that norm is also about minority rule because people in cities have just so much less political power, definitely in the Senate to some extent in the House, and because Republicans aren't really even forced to compete for votes of people in the cities. Instead, their maintaining power sort of depends on disenfranchising people in the cities, that you can speak about them as if they are kind of lesser Americans, not real Americans. Real Americans are people who live in the countryside and work in agriculture and manufacturing, as Tom Cotton said. When Tom Cotton was saying why D.C. didn't deserve statehood, he said, it's because they don't, well, Wyoming is different. Wyoming has people who work in manufacturing. Wyoming has people who work in agriculture, as if that's what gives them the right to representation in our government.
Yeah. The other bigger issue here, and this is something you and I have talked about a lot, you've written about, is that because we've got this geographic polarization, that this median Senate seat is 6 or 7 percentage points more GOP leaning than the nation, right? So you've got this structural advantage in the Senate where, like, Republicans can hold a majority in the Senate with 40%, 42%, 43% of the popular vote, as it were, even though that doesn't happen for the Senate. But it's just a conservative institution. This is one small way of rebalancing. And I wonder, like, do Democrats in the Senate understand how important that is?
I think most of them do, but obviously not all of them. It's not only I don't think right now that you have enough Democrats to break a filibuster for this. It's not totally clear that you even have all 50 Democratic senators on board. So I think most Democrats understand the broader sort of crisis of democracy that we're in and the importance of democracy reform. We're in this situation where minority rule makes it impossible to address minority rule. And meanwhile, sort of the minority keeps entrenching itself further and further. And we have a very small window in which it's possible to address that. But again, because of the veto power of these minority factions, addressing it is extremely difficult.
That's exactly right. Minority rule, entrenching minority rule, got to break the logjam. Michelle Goldberg, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, as climate change threatens the water supply in Los Angeles, the city has a new creative and eyebrow-raising solution. Jacob Soboroff and the plan to go from toilet to tap after this.
Deserve representation. Yes. And indeed, the contempt with which members of our government speak about residents of D.C., I think, is a sign of how badly they need representation.
That's a great point. I mean, you get all these, like, really gross, like, sort of snippy comments about, like, who D.C. people are in a way that you would never say about residents of other states, but precisely is sayable because they don't have any way of pushing back because they don't have representation.
Well, and there's also just a sort of norm in our politics that people can speak extremely contemptuously about people in cities. And part of that norm is also about minority rule because people in cities have just so much less political power, definitely in the Senate to some extent in the House, and because Republicans aren't really even forced to compete for votes of people in the cities. Instead, their maintaining power sort of depends on disenfranchising people in the cities, that you can speak about them as if they are kind of lesser Americans, not real Americans. Real Americans are people who live in the countryside and work in agriculture and manufacturing. As Tom Cotton said, when Tom Cotton was saying why D.C. didn't deserve statehood, he said, it's because they don't, well, Wyoming is different. Wyoming has people who work in manufacturing. Wyoming has people who work in agriculture, as if that's what gives them the right to representation in our government.
Yeah. The other bigger issue here, and this is something you and I have talked about a lot, you've written about, is that, because we've got this geographic polarization, that this median Senate seat is 6 or 7 percentage points more GOP leaning than the nation, right? So you've got this structural advantage in the Senate where, like, Republicans can hold a majority in the Senate with 40%, 42%, 43% of the popular vote, as it were, even though that doesn't happen for the Senate. But it's just a conservative institution. This is one small way of rebalancing. And I wonder, like, do Democrats in the Senate understand how important that is?
I think most of them do, but obviously not all of them. It's not only I don't think right now that you have enough Democrats to break a filibuster for this. It's not totally clear that you even have all 50 Democratic senators on board. So I think most Democrats understand the broader sort of crisis of democracy that we're in and the importance of democracy reform. We're in this situation where minority rule makes it impossible to address minority rule. And meanwhile, sort of the minority keeps entrenching itself further and further. And we have a very small window in which it's possible to address that. But again, because of the veto power of these minority factions, addressing it is extremely difficult.
That's exactly right. Minority rule, entrenching minority rule, got to break the logjam. Michelle Goldberg, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, as climate change threatens the water supply in Los Angeles, the city has a new creative and eyebrow-raising solution. Jacob Soboroff on the plan to go from toilet to tap after this.